The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the leading center for research in black culture in America. Glad to have you with us, Khalil.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
Now tell us, how'd you get to the job?
A little bit of luck, a little bit of ambition, and a
lot of
calls made on my behalf.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a search committee impaneled by members of the New York Public Library's Board of Trustees, some community and educational leaders in Harlem and around the New York area, and they got together and had a very full pool of candidates, and I emerged at the end of a very long process as the new director.
Well, Schomburg is very lucky to have you, but you got a lot of work to do.
I do.
The Schomburg started, Arturo Schomburg and his collection, in an old building on 135th Street. Now we have a new building at 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard. And you have a lot of different programs. What are some of the programs that you are focusing on in your first year or so at the Schomburg?
Sure. We're paying a lot of attention to working on getting young people excited about the Schomburg Center. Over the course of its 85 years, it's in the midst of celebrating its 85th anniversary, the Schomburg Center hasn't been able to cultivate and develop as much programming as I think is necessary today to get young people excited about history, and particularly about a history that is not often explored to the extent that it deserves to be in our public school systems.
Well, the Schomburg Center is a research center.
That's correct.
It's not just a library that distributes books and so on. And as a research center for years, writers who about the black experience have gone to the Schomburg, explored their archives and so on, and it's well known for that. The larger community that are not researchers haven't had much experience with the Schomburg until recently with the theater and in the new building. So how do you bridge that gap between the scholars and the community that really wants to know more about the black experience?
Well, that's where programming and exhibitions come into play. So with very smart and strategic programming, widely marketed, where the word of mouth gets us people excited about coming there. If we have great exhibitions, we just finished with an exhibition focused on Romare Bearden, his centennial anniversary. Also, we are focusing in this season on an exhibition that features Malcolm X. Those are opportunities and teaching moments to introduce one of the 20th century's greatest painters and one of the 20th century's greatest civil rights and black freedom struggle activists to an entire new generation of young people. So that's really where we can bridge the gap between what is our core mission as a research library and our outreach mission in terms of educating and inspiring and empowering young people with black history.
Well, what about your outreach to schools? Because I know the schools are in from 8 to 4. Do you let them come into the library, or do you bring the library to the schools?
We do a little bit of both, but mostly they come to the library. Just yesterday, we had 300 students. This is a regular occurrence in terms of daily traffic. Oftentimes, teachers will contact our education manager and say, we'd like to bring a group of students. We had 9th graders, 3rd graders, all mingled together, enjoying the Langston Hughes Auditorium for a program.
What was the nature of the program?
In this season, we again are celebrating African Americans, and so Langston Hughes, it was a tribute to Langston Hughes. And interestingly, talking to many of those young people, some of them had never heard of Langston Hughes, and that's not...
Most of them probably.
Most of them. But I think I want to say something to qualify that. I don't think we should condemn a 10-year-old for not knowing Langston Hughes. He passed away a very long time ago. I think we should just make sure that we create a space and an opportunity for them to be introduced to them, and then let the parents and teachers take over from there.
That's a very positive point, because a recent survey showed that 38% of high school students didn't know anything about World War II. which was a landmark in American history.
Sure, absolutely. And in fact, I would add to that that a recent study done by the Southern Poverty Law Center in September of last year found that only 2% of the nation's high school seniors passed a basic literacy test in civil rights history. So in some ways, we are at a crisis in terms of historical literacy around the very issues that have made America a beacon and a symbol of the transformative impact of ideas about liberty and freedom. Obviously, America is always a work in progress, but we can't just look at the end or look at where we are now without understanding how we've gotten to this point.
And where we are now, as you say, many of the things that will happen, like the profiling of youth by the police, like the denial of welfare benefits, like the denial of voting rights, that's because race has been the prototypic division point in America. We were founded on slavery. The Constitution endorsed slavery, but the Constitution also didn't give women any rights. More than 1920, they got the right to vote. So there's something there. Now, you've written this book, Condemnation of Blackness. Now, what are you saying in that book that I don't know or I need to know and our audience needs to know?
Well, I think the point that I want to make is that our problem with unprecedented incarceration rates, the fact that there are more people in prison today than at any time in American history, and we outpace in terms of incarceration any other nation in the world.
Yeah, the United States has more people, white or black,
right,
in jail than any other country in the world.
That's correct.
Now,
so,
why do you think that is?
Well, I think it has to do with the way that the larger economy in this country has shifted from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy largely based on services. Now, we've also moved into the information age, but there was a critical juncture in the mid-20th century where factory work was in decline, and we began to outsource, and so even as late as the 1990s, jobs were continuing to move abroad. Well, the criminal justice system has become a government system that has captured all of those people who no longer have the kind of blue-collar, stable work that allow for a productive economy for everyone. And it may sound cynical to some, but the truth is, if you look at a chart tracking deindustrialization in this country from the 1940s to today, it's a chart that goes in this direction. If you look at the growth of the prison system starting in the 1970s, it goes in this direction.
But wasn't a lot of that due to the drug trade and the drug culture, where people who really shouldn't have been in prison were incarcerated because of possession?
Absolutely. So the war on drugs began in the very late 1960s, where federal dollars under Lyndon Baines Johnson was first being pumped into it. So in that regard, you're right, that's a policy choice. But let me just make this point. In the 1920s, of course, the nation criminalized alcohol. And so in that moment, the issue was alcohol, like drugs today, but it turned out to be a big fiasco. It incentivized young men to engage in an underground economy, and it produced all sorts of violence. And so the nation reversed course. So the war on drugs, you're right, is the set of policies that came into being that drove incarceration, but the larger context was a policy decision to use prisons again to deal with a social problem, which is drug addiction.
Now, when you say there was a policy decision to do that, weren't they responding to the outrage in the community about drugs, or were they responding to the fear of black youth walking the streets?
Both. So I think you had community members who were concerned about public safety in their communities, black and brown people, people of African and Latino ancestry living in inner city communities, demanding justice, demanding accountable, safe policing. And so that was sort of the liberal call for a more punitive response to drug addiction in those communities. But on the other hand, you had a rising conservative political establishment that had already criminalized civil rights activism. Right? I mean, all those young people going to jail were, in effect, being criminalized for demanding their freedom. Well, that just increased and intensified. So as you well know, under Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew stepped up, programs like COINTELPRO, policing became a kind of frontline defense of white communities that were concerned about the consequences of a civil rights movement where black people might be going to schools in formerly all-white neighborhoods and living there and dating their daughters. And so policing became much more intense and much more intensified form of racial surveillance in a post-civil rights moment.
Well, let's say that we want to change this policy. About 3/4 of the people in prison are people of African American, Latino descent.
That's a little higher, but it's close to 70%.
What is the actual number?
It's about 70%. So
Yeah.
I don't want it to be any
Okay,
higher.
well,
than
all right.
actually
Well,
it is.
but the thing is, if they decriminalize the possession of small amounts of drugs and selling it, and they let the people out and put them on probation, make them go to school, that would drastically diminish the prison population. Now, to what extent do you think that can happen in our society today? Because prisons cost money, and taxpayers are beginning to be concerned about it.
Right.
And there's a lot of work you and others have done to show that it'd be much better if these people had minor community service sentences and we came to work and add to the economy.
Right.
Do you think that's a possibility in our society today?
I think it is, but I think it requires a new cultural moment to get people to think differently about these issues.
But what is the cultural moment?
Here's one point. Most Americans don't pay much attention to nor appreciate the fact that drug use in this country is equal across the board. And in fact, we know that among young Americans, it is young white male Americans who show a slightly greater tendency to consume illegal drugs. And yet, in states across the nation, 80 to 90% of those who go to prison on nonviolent drug charges are black or brown. That requires education. That requires a courage and confidence to have that conversation at the highest political levels, in our classrooms, on the street, rather than being written off as sort of either anti-American or pro-black or just simply angry and divisive. So that's what I mean. The culture in our country does not allow for really appreciating in a robust way how we live in a moment where new forms of racial oppression, institutionalized discrimination, have been invented after the civil rights movement.
Well, this is like deja vu all over again. They had prohibition in 1918 to 1932, right. And they finally realized it wasn't working. Should we think about legalizing certain recreational drugs?
I think marijuana would be a great place to start. That's the point, and that's why I mentioned it earlier.
Now, do you think that the society would understand this?
Well, that's what I mean. So we've got cultural work to do. We've got teaching to do. We've got to change the language and the stigma attached to drugs. As you may recall, in the prior administration before President Obama, marijuana came in for being a gateway drug. So in all of the conversation about medicalizing marijuana, the federal response was, well, you know, this is just the beginning of getting more kids hooked on narcotics. And so you start with marijuana, you end up with cocaine and heroin. Well, research doesn't show that to be true. And what's incredibly ironic about our cultural understanding of all these issues is that alcohol causes more lives, kills more people annually than all narcotics combined. And so it's not really about the inherent danger and risk of the actual stimulant. It's our politics and culture around certain drugs.
Well, actually, if some upper-class white people were charged with drug use and moving, the society would change. What happens, though, is when that occurs, the white population puts them on the side as well, so they just like everybody else. So we got a lot of education to do, but given that you run the Schomburg, it's nice that you're doing this. What else would you like to focus on to help change the condition of black folks? I know when you're young, you want to change everything. All right, now we're working on decriminalizing marijuana. What's next you want to work on?
Well, before we move on, let me just say this. I don't want to be the conservator of our collective racial history and have people say, where were you when mass incarceration happened? It would be the equivalent of being in a small Birmingham town when Martin Luther King showed up in 1963 and you stayed home. So I'm out doing the work that I
Good.
think is necessary in this historical moment to improve the life chances of black and brown people in this country.
But basically, it's a political task. You really need to testify before political bodies, get some politicians to agree with this. And this takes a long while. Basically, it was the crime associated with prohibition that caused the prohibition to be repealed.
Right.
Because upper class people were using it and going to speakeasies and so on, but the crime was so bad. Now, the crime here is that many people are incarcerated because of just mere possession, and that, of course, is negative for the larger society.
Now, let me get back to your question.
Let's get back to the Schomburg now. This is very interesting.
So in terms of, you did make reference to it being political work. Well, that is true, although I don't necessarily see my job leading the political charge. But what we need, all political work requires constituencies. And to me, the greatest untapped resource of constituents to deal with this issue are young people, right? So as far as I'm concerned, I've got to start with school-age children so that they are educated about the society that they're growing up in, whether it's a jobless recovery, where they are still being taught to believe in school, to believe in opportunity, and yet where are the jobs? Whether it's their civil liberties when they step out of their homes, what rights do they have to pass freely in our society without being subjected to policies such as stop and frisk? I think kids should grow up knowing what their futures are in this moment and being able to challenge that and to be critical consumers of those experiences. So that's a kind of political work, but it first starts with education.
Well, with regard to education, not many, some black children think it's not cool to be smart, that they don't need to know mathematics, they don't need to know the language because it's not going to make any difference. And they set up a counterculture which works against that. How do you confront that?
Well, precisely by recognizing their reality. I think when educators and preachers and outsiders, motivational speakers show up and they just start saying, work hard, keep your head down, keep your eyes on the prize, and they don't pay attention to the actual lived experiences of those kids, that they don't really show empathy and understanding and compassion for the struggles that they have, that it may not be easy in a small apartment with loud noises, with kids crying, to be able to focus.
How do you overcome that? How do you overcome telling a kid who lives in that to study? Do you let them not study?
You get them to the library.
You get them to the library now.
No, and I mean that with all
I understand that, but Schomburg is not a library where you bring kids to do their homework.
Well, it is attached to County Cullen, so we do have a branch library that is literally part of the same building. So as far as, again, as far as I'm concerned, the library has to be a first resort response to the needs of young people today in terms of creating a safe, constructive space for them to hear new ideas, for them to think differently about who they are in the world, and for adults in that space to nurture and empower them with information.
But how do you deal with the fact that technology now is replacing books and personal interaction with teachers? How do you deal with that? Because on technology, people can find all kinds of things. Much of it is incorrect. So how do you help young people to interact with the technology and interact with the scholarship?
Well, you embrace it. So if you hide from it and you shrink from it, then young people won't trust you.
Well, how do you embrace it at the Schomburg?
Well, we are fundraising to embrace it. we are in a situation, the last 3 years of the recession has limited the New York Public Library's ability to really keep up.
What is the budget of the Schomburg now?
It's about $7 million.
And it should be 20?
Well, the budget should be, yes, it should be $20 million. We've had a conversation about fundraising. I think in terms of fundraising, the Schomburg needs to fundraise about $25 million to meet the vision of a place that can be a welcoming place for young people, that can use the latest digital technology to not only process our archives, right, to catch up with the demands of our researchers who increasingly want material to be delivered in a digital format, as well as to attract new audiences to the amazing, rich collections of the Schomburg Center.
How much would it take to do that?
It would take about $25 million.
So for people who are listening and have access to resources, should they give money generally to the Schomburg, or should it be specifically for the digital library or the archives or whatever?
Well, the first thing is that the Schomburg is part of the New York Public Library. So they should donate generously on behalf of the Schomburg Center so that that money goes towards these initiatives. And those initiatives within the digital initiatives, within a children's gallery. As I've said to you, we are very excited about in 2014, we will have the space for a children's gallery, and we want to outfit
Where will that space be?
It will be in our current gift shop. The current gift shop, as I know you know, Dr. Brown, is in the back of the building. It's going to move to the front of the building, and that will create a space there which is adjacent to our current exhibition hall. The Schomburg Center is ripe for opportunities in terms of philanthropists and for giving, but also for everyday people. We have a membership society program that starts at $35, goes up to $5,000 and beyond for people who want to demonstrate their commitment to this institution. No other institution in this country and indeed the world has been in the business of collecting, preserving, and interpreting the Black global experience for as long as the Schomburg Center.
What would you say to African Americans who would like to donate their archives to Schomburg?
Sure.
Do you accept those?
We do with a very...
With some money.
No, with a very rigorous screening process for the materials quality in terms of enhancing the research value of the institution. What we like to do, though, is to encourage people to believe in preservation, because every family, every community, every church, every organization has a story to tell. And although the Schomburg Center may not be the home for every story that is captured in those personal archives, we fundamentally believe in preservation. And we want people to be able to pass on those stories and those artifacts to their own families.
So you'd like to help them preserve it themselves?
Well, we want to educate on the necessity for preservation. But frankly, there are inherent costs in accepting all donations. And so we do have to make a choice about which collections we accept and which ones we don't. The Schomburg Center is literally bursting at the seams. So
I know it is.
we pay a lot of money for storage costs. But if you ask the question about fundraising and there is a viewer watching this, we could also build a new building. So that would increase our capacity to accept more material over time.
Now, you know, I was a Tuskegee Airman, flew combat.
Were you really?
World War II.
I'd never heard of this.
Never heard it. Now, if somebody wanted to find out what the Amsterdam News said about the Tuskegee Airmen in March of 1945, could you find that at the Schomburg?
Absolutely.
How would you go about it?
Well, we have computers that are attached to a database called ProQuest Historical Newspapers. And the New York Amsterdam News is there, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Los Angeles Sentinel, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, so on and so forth. And it's really easy. You walk in, you go to the computer, you type in Tuskegee Airmen, you put a date range, and all the articles across all of those newspapers will appear in something like 30 seconds. It's pretty amazing. And it's a very different world than the one that you grew up in when you were researching as a child.
You have to go and look.
You'd have to look through an index.
Now, suppose somebody wanted to get a list of all the poems that Langston Hughes had written and see those poems. Is that possible in Schomburg?
It is possible. I don't know that, well, I'm sure it's possible. You know why? Because there are annotated collections of Langston Hughes's work. And so that would more than likely be in book form. And we have an amazing book collection.
Now, if I wanted to see that, I'd have to apply in advance, and you'd have it there, so when I come, I'd actually be able to see the book?
If it's a book, you wouldn't have to apply in advance. You just come to our General Research and Reference Division, which is on the first floor, and you speak to a librarian. And very courteously, they would obtain that annotated collection of Langston Hughes's work.
Yeah, I have been to the Schomburg. I've done this. I'm doing this for the audience.
Yes.
Now, as we come to the close of the program, what are your first 3 priorities for the Schomburg in the next 6 to 8 months?
Sure. So first is to develop partnerships with education and community leaders to focus on those young people. I've already started some of this work. As you know, I'm a former college professor. I taught for 6 years, African American and U.S. history, and I bring that commitment to education into this position. And so I've been teaching young people for the past 4 months, and I continue to do it. So they may not be college students, but they're our kids. They range in ages from 11 to 17. So that's one focus. The other focus is to cultivate new audiences. I feel as though the Schomburg Center has a wonderful constituency of older and veteran supporters, people that have been using that institution for a very long time, and certainly my predecessor, Howard Dotson, really brought them into the institution, and they've remained loyal to the institution. But frankly, any people from ages 5 to 45 years of age are disproportionately underrepresented at the Schomburg. So with very smart and engaging and to some degree provocative programming, the idea is that we will reach out to these node audiences and give young folks a reason, and at this point I'm talking about the 25 years, a reason to not go downtown or midtown, but come uptown to the Schomburg.
Now, if they want to do this, do they call Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad at a given number, or they go to the website? How do they get in touch with you?
They go to schomburg.org, schomburg.org, and click on our public programs, and they see an exciting list of events happening.
But suppose they walked in the door.
If they walk in the door, then they go to the rack and they pull a program guide, and there it's all printed. One of the exciting things, the third initiative, is to usher in, to see this process of a new construction. So the Schomburg will be undergoing a series of renovations beginning next year, but the process of meeting and planning and designing and making decisions about what those renovations look like are happening right now. And that's very exciting because, to come back to that point of young people, that's going to create the space for the Children's Gallery. So at some point, when school buses pull up over the next 3 years, kids will be able to disembark, walk through the doors, and go to a place in that building, unlike ever before in its history, that is dedicated to them.
Well, as we come to the close of the program, I want to congratulate you on what you're doing, your vision, and I hope that members of our audience will join the Schomburg, support the Schomburg, and go and ask Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad some very difficult questions. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me on the show. It was wonderful.
Okay, take care.